Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening, both in person and remotely, for St. Thomas More College's 35th Annual Michael Keenan Memorial Lecture. My name is Tammy March, and I currently serve as the Dean of St. Thomas More College. As I speak to you from STM's auditorium this evening, I would like to acknowledge that I, along with all of us here in the auditorium, as well as some of you online, are in Treaty 6 territory and homeland of the Métis. Some of you are likely joining us from other traditional territories, so welcome. As we continue our work on reconciliation, I would like to acknowledge, respect, and reaffirm our relationship with our First Nations and Métis ancestors, and to all the Indigenous peoples in Canada who have given us the privilege of using these lands. I wish everyone safe, fruitful, and respectful encounters in these homelands and territories. The Keenan Lecture is STM's signature academic event, and we are very happy to be able to hold this lecture in person as well as to live stream the lecture. Although it has been 37 years since our first lecture in 1987, this year is a special year as it marks the 35th time that we have had the privilege to offer the Keenan Lecture. Got a problem? Can't hear me? Oh, I know I'm short, but as many of you know, the Keenan Lecture commemorates and celebrates the life and achievements of Dr. Michael Keenan. He was born in 1937 and died in 1986. I hope that you have all been enjoying the PowerPoint presentation, which includes many of the Keenan pictures that we were able to find around the college. Thanks to Laura Mitchell and for all her work on this, and to all others who assisted with the collection of these photos. I know that there are some long-time attendees at the lecture this evening, and there are years in which we have no photos at all. So if you happen to have any pictures that you didn't see captured here this evening, we would love to receive a copy for our files. Dr. Michael Keenan completed a BA and a master's degree in psychology at Assumption University in Windsor, Ontario in the early 60s. After which he worked for the Ontario government for a year assisting patients at the psychiatric hospital in St. Thomas. Mike then taught developmental psychology for 2 years at King's College, now King's University College, which is affiliated with the University of Western Ontario. Mike first came to STM on the invitation of Father Peter Swan in 1965, who was serving as the principal of STM at that time. Father Swan had been at Assumption University a few years earlier as its registrar, which is how he knew Mike. However, after 2 years at STM, Mike, with his wife Pat and their young children, went back to Ontario so that he could pursue his doctoral studies in psychology at the University of Waterloo. Mike taught sessionally as a graduate student in developmental psychology while he finished his graduate work. When he finished his PhD, he came back to STM. That was in 1971. In addition to teaching courses in developmental psychology, he served as head of the psychology department, and within 4 years was appointed as the dean, the first dean of STM. He served in that role from 1975 to 1985. Throughout his years as dean, Mike remained dedicated to his students, and he loved teaching in his field of child psychology. He was known for his quiet leadership, for the quiet leadership that he provided to STM, for his insistence on high academic standards, and for the humor and affability which characterized his public and private life. Pat, along with one of their 3 children, as well as 2 grandchildren, I believe, if I got that right, have remained in Saskatoon, and they have become part of the life of the college. We are very fortunate to have Pat joining us here this evening, up here in the front, as well as Mike and Pat's son, Terry, and Terry's wife, Terry Ann, and their daughter, Pat and Mike's granddaughter, Nadia. It's so great to have all you here for the 35th lecture. Really appreciate it. To commemorate Mike's close bond with STM, the Keenan family, Pat, along with Mike's twin brother, Robert, with the assistance of STM's Board of Governors and some faculty at the time, established this annual lecture. The lecture takes place each fall on a date close to the anniversary of Mike's death on October 31st. We have been privileged to listen to leading intellectuals and leaders from various fields since the first lecture in 1987. Through all these years, this lecture has become a celebration not only of Mike Keenan's service and dedication to our college, but also of the Keenan family's commitment to what our college stands for, and intellectual synthesis of faith and reason. It has been the mission of this lecture to invite scholars who give presentations that explore this relationship. In that sense, Pat and her family have remained an essential part of the STM family and its mission. For that, we are very grateful, Pat. And has become our custom or our tradition, we have a small token of our appreciation for you and your family, which the students are going to, Henry and Jared, are going to present to you now. Thanks again, Pat and the Keenan family. We appreciate all the support. They're big. We can put them aside for now and we can grab them later. So Dr. John Liptay, who is a faculty member in STM's philosophy department, will now introduce our 35th Michael Keenan Memorial Lecture. Thank you, everyone.
Good evening. This year's Keenan Lecture, the Reverend Professor James F. Keenan, is the Canisius Chair, Director of the Jesuit Institute, and Vice Provost of Global Engagement at Boston College. A Jesuit priest since 1982, he received a licentiate and a doctorate from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. Since then, he has edited or written over 25 books and published over 400 essays, articles, and reviews worldwide. In 2003, he founded an international network of ethicists called Catholic Theological Ethics in the World Church, CTEWC, and subsequently hosted 3 international and 6 regional conferences. Today, CTEWC has its own book series and is a live network of over 1,000 Catholic ethicists. In recent years, he has written University Ethics, How Colleges Can Build and Benefit from a Culture of Ethics, published by Rowman and Littlefield in 2015, and A History of Catholic Theological Ethics, published by Paulist Press in 2022. In 2023, Georgetown University Press published The Moral Life, his Darcy Memorial Lectures given at Oxford University in 2022. I believe there's an advertisement about that at the entrance to the auditorium. In 2019, he received the John Courtney Murray Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society of Christian Ethics, and from 2020 to 2021, served as that society's president. Over 30 years ago, in a review of Father Keenan's first book, Goodness and Rightness, in Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, one of his Jesuit confreres, who has since gone to the Lord, wrote that he, Father Keenan, should be one of the shaping voices in the next generation of American Catholic moral theology, end quote. It was a remarkably prescient claim. Please welcome Father James Keenan.
So I'm just marveling at the prior lecturers. Ewart Cousins, when I started teaching at Fordham, Ewart Cousins was one of my colleagues. Sharon Delaz Parks, I remember writing to her when she was at Harvard and I was over at Weston School of Theology, and we were both raising questions about formation and virtue. Louis Dupre was with me at Boston College. I'm looking at all these names. I know half of them. Pat McCormick was a very good friend of mine. Michelle Dillon, I know well her work. You had Margaret Archer. I would have paid to come here. So It's a real privilege to be here, and I'm honored that the Keenan family is here. So let me get underway. I want to tell you two things that just to prepare you for this lecture. The first is that years ago, I've been teaching. I have this way of teaching that I take a course, and it goes with me for quite a while. When I started teaching at Fordham, I decided to teach a course on abortion. I felt that everybody had an opinion on abortion, and nobody read anything on abortion. So I had a course for the average 13, 14 weeks, but 3 times a week, that I had 3 articles per class, so 9 articles a week for 13 weeks. And I had a quiz for every class so that they had to come into the class having read those articles. And it was the most popular course at Fordham, that they had, and it would shut down in about an hour in registration. But I did it simply because I wanted people to, be informed and to think things through. So over the past, I'd say, when HIV started, I started a course called HIV, AIDS, and Ethics, and I took a theme each class. I could take condoms or needle exchange, or I could take gender, why gender matters, why people of certain income. I had a class on tariffs. You name the issue, but I had an issue each class so that the students appreciated what were fundamental concerns about global public health by looking at HIV/AIDS. And the last time I taught it was in 2020, as another pandemic was coming. And in fact, I was the first faculty member at BC to go online because I had 40 students cramped in this one little space. And I was scared to death that they'd get infected. And so we went online. And we were talking about a new pandemic coming, just as we were learning a lot about a pandemic and how to proceed. In any event, one of the times with teaching this course on HIV, AIDS, and ethics, I had these 40 students. What I would do is I would always make sure that I would let in 10 students, but then I would gatekeep to let the next 30 in. So I had a very talented class. They had to tell me that either they were working for the Gates Foundation, or they were the Clinton Foundation, or they had worked in Haiti, or they were doing something on HIV. I wanted people who knew HIV to be in the class, but I would have 40 of them. So it was a very talented class. They know everything about HIV. One time, at the end of class breaks out, 40 kids running out of the class, and an incident happened in the hallway. And I could just see from the door, an incident happening. And a student had collapsed. Not from my class, but another student in the hallway. And I watched the reactions of my students. And some were responsive. Others were shaking their shoulders, going, "What was that?" "Oh, what?" And just walked away. I was really surprised that they knew almost everything about what to do in an AIDS crisis. But the question that got me was not did they know what to do here, but were they responsive to it? That's all I wanted to know. Were they responsive? And I began to do a critique of all my work of saying that I've been trying to teach people what's right, but the prior question, will they bother to do it in the first place, kept bothering me. And so I've been doing all this work on vulnerability and recognition now that I'm going to introduce you to by way of talking about grief. So I just want to give you some background. I'm really interested in this question. We teach people what they should know, but whether they're going to do anything is another issue. It's a prior issue. And that's what I'm going to be saying, that unless people are vulnerable, and that's the second point I want to make, I'm going to use the word vulnerable, not meaning precarity or having been wounded, because that's not what the word means. It means the capability of being wounded. It means that you're open to another to the point of being wounded. Christ on the cross is that, but he was vulnerable before he was crucified. So the question is, are we vulnerable as adults? And were my students vulnerable? And if people are vulnerable, then they know how to respond to others. And that's the question I'm interested in now, is how do Catholic institutions really promote vulnerability and what I would call the skill of recognizing what needs to be done? So those are two little keys. Let me start. It is important to remember that the disciples were gathered in the upper room from the death of Jesus to the Pentecost, moving initially from grieving to the recognition of Jesus as risen Lord. Attending to their experience of grief and the attendant experience of being vulnerable, they were subsequently incited to recognize the risen Jesus and the Holy Spirit. Believing that vulnerability and recognition are the conditions for acting out of conscience, as I have developed elsewhere, I propose this evening to connect all four, grief, vulnerability, recognition, and conscience, to one another as effective ways that the Spirit summons us. My talk is divided into two parts, an extended reflection on grief, and then the topics of vulnerability, recognition, and conscience. So now, grief. On Tuesday, May 19th, 2015, I received word that my best friend, the Hong Kong Jesuit Yu Sing Lucas Chan, had died of a heart attack, having collapsed on a bench in the corridor of the theology department of Marquette University. Trying to get to his office as he was returning from his daily early morning workout at the university gym, Lucas gave up his last at 6:45 a.m. before any of his colleagues arrived. They found his body on the floor. He was 46 years old, the epitome of healthy living, and his death was overwhelming for all of us, his colleagues, friends, and family. His funeral at Marquette would not be for at least a week, but on May 24th, I was scheduled to preside at the Sunday liturgy at St. Peter's Parish in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I had worked by that point for nearly 20 years. That Sunday would be Pentecost Sunday. Facing Pentecost, the birthday of the church, the celebration of the Spirit's descent into the midst of the gathering in the upper room and sending them out, inspired and with tongues of fire, I asked myself, how could I bring grief, my grief, to that liturgy? Moreover, since the community knew me well, many would learn by Sunday that Lucas had died. I would have to bring his sudden grievous death into my Pentecost homily, and this brought me to a new understanding of Pentecost. I need to tell you that I had known sudden death before. My brother Bob died during an early morning seizure of epilepsy when he was 26 years old. I was 27. That day, June 2nd, 1980, changed the lives of all of us in my family. From Bob's death, I learned the importance of grieving with others, and that grief alone is a dreadful, painful grief. Grief is meant to be shared, whether in shiva or in a wake. In preparation for the Sunday liturgy, I began asking myself, what were the disciples of Jesus doing in the upper room on the eve of what we now call the Pentecost? Indeed, they were waiting for the Spirit, as Luke tells us, but I believe they were waiting in grief. In fact, I believe their grieving was constitutive to the process of their recognizing Jesus. Their ability to subsequently witness to Jesus, the very message of Pentecost, witnessing to Jesus, was prompted by their grieving. The scriptures bear this out. In the so-called long canonical ending of Mark's Gospel, we learn that the 11 were gathered in the upper room, that they were, quote, mourning and weeping, Mark 16:10. Mary Magdalene knows that they are there and reports to them that Jesus is alive, but they do not believe her. Again, 2 more come to report to them in the upper room that they met Jesus on a road. This is in Mark's Gospel. But again, they do not believe. Later, we do not know how much later, Jesus himself comes to the upper room. They recognize him now, and he rebukes them for not believing the reports, then commissions them to preach, and then ascends. In Luke, we hear that on Sunday, 3 days after the death of Jesus, the women, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the other women, discover the empty tomb and encounter the two men in dazzling clothes who tell them that he has been raised. They run to the disciples in the upper room, and the grieving disciples do not believe them, though Peter runs to the tomb and is amazed by the tomb being empty. Then the encounter at Emmaus is described in Luke's gospel, where two disciples, in their shared grief, for that is what prevents them from recognizing him, talk of Jesus' death, but then in the breaking of the bread recognize him and rush back again to the upper room to tell the 11. As they enter the room, the 11 tell the two from Emmaus that the Lord has risen and appeared to Peter, and then the two make their report known. Unlike Mark, Luke reports that the 11 reportedly believed that Jesus has been raised before Jesus appears, which then occurs as the Emmaus disciples are present. Jesus extends to them his peace, eats fish, and tells them to stay in Jerusalem because he is sending upon you what my Father promised. He walks to Bethany and then ascends. In the Acts of the Apostles, after the ascension of Jesus, the disciples return to Jerusalem and immediately go to the upper room, where we are told the 11 were staying. This is even after the Pentecost. They're still going to the upper room, devoting themselves to prayer together with certain women, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, as well as his brothers. Luke makes a point that they are there for days between the end of the resurrection appearances and the Pentecost, during which they chose a 12th to replace Judas. Then the day of Pentecost occurs. Again, it seems that they are in the upper room, and the Spirit now descends on them and fills the entire house. In John, Mary Magdalene discovers the empty tomb, rushes to report the missing body of Jesus to Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved. They rush to the tomb and then return to their houses. Mary, however, remains at the tomb, and she is grieving outside the tomb, distressed that not only Jesus' life has been taken away, but also now his body has been taken away. Jesus approaches her in her grief and confusion, and she does not recognize him until he calls her by name. She clings to him. He tells her to stop holding on, and then commissions her to tell the disciples. Jesus later that day, John reports, goes to the disciples who are gathered in the upper room, and then returns a week later again to the upper room to reveal himself to Thomas. When I had to preach on Pentecost, I experienced in myself such a grief that I was fully vulnerable to the working of the Holy Spirit. In fact, I resonated with the disciples weeping and grieving in the upper room, where they could not believe the news being reported. I resonated with the grief of Mary, who first weeps outside the tomb, thinking that now even the body of Christ is gone. She cannot recognize Jesus by sight, but only later through her grief when she hears his name. And I resonate with the disciples of Emmaus who had such hopes that they cannot recognize their fellow pilgrim until he breaks the bread. Their grief, however, was not an obstacle to their eventual capacity to recognize Jesus. Let me read that again. Their grief was not an obstacle to their eventual capacity to recognize Jesus, but rather the passageway to recognition. Through their grieving, they became vulnerable enough to their love for Jesus that they could recognize his presence, his risen presence. These words, grief, vulnerability, and recognition, words in the title of this talk, are here inextricably linked to the Pentecost story, and in particular to the role the Spirit plays in our lives and in the church. The phenomenon of grief, which I call the willing openness to the loss of love, the willing openness to the loss of love. During that Pentecost, I discovered that my grief was not an effect of love, but a form of love. In fact, whenever I touch that grief, I encounter the love that connected me to my friend Lucas. Entrance into grief is not solely an encounter with absence, but with presence as well. The more one feels the presence of the love, the deeper one feels the loss. And yet the gulf of love remains, like the upper room itself, a place of vulnerability. When I think of the disciples, Mary and the others grieving in the upper room, I think it was there that they gathered to grieve. There, after all, was where they celebrated the Last Supper, a meal that Jesus initiated to be repeated after his forthcoming departure. There they returned after the time in the Mount of Olives, on Golgotha, and from the burial in the tomb. When the 12 are gathered in the upper room with Mary, they are grieving with one another. They're going there because they are sharing their grief, but their grief is not like some contemporary check-in. They are not consoling one another by saying, "Are you okay? Mary, how are you doing? Peter, are you okay?" I think instead they just talked about all the love they experienced from Jesus and that they wanted to hear from one another how Jesus was loved by others. And so they wanted to hear how Peter loved Jesus, how Mary, the mother of Jesus, loved Jesus, how the Magdalene loved Jesus, how Andrew and John and others loved Jesus. And it's in the hearing of these narratives that I think that they were consoled. In their shared grief, they gave one another to experience their love for and from Jesus. And it was in that space that first Jesus and then the Spirit found its place to enter into that upper room. Into the loving grief of the upper room, the Spirit found her place. The Pentecost is not simply a sign of the Spirit's descent or the birth of the church, as we've always said. It is a moment of people grieving, people consoling one another about the fact that they loved Jesus, who loved them and died for them. Out of their expression of griefs, they recognized their salvation and found a way to move forward by the Spirit. In a similar way, every Christian funeral is a replay of the upper room. When I preside at a funeral, I enter into not the presence, but the felt absence of the person loved, the raw, emotional, gut-wrenching experience of love exposed because the other has died. Those who believe the promise of the resurrection encounter it not by negating grief or transcending it, but by entering it. The promise is not a quick fix imposed, but rather something believers recognize as they grieve. Through grief, we experience and can recognize the promise of the resurrection. The felt love with the now deceased remains as the bridge through grief. Now a word on the gap of grief. Several weeks after my brother Bobby died, I received from another Jesuit a letter with these words from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He wrote this letter to tell me, he said, "I didn't write to you immediately when I heard the news. I've actually kept this letter on my desk for several weeks because I want you to know that at this point, I'm still thinking of you." And so I do this as a practice now, many years, 40 years later, to anybody who's I write a note. I wait a month, 2 months, 3 months, and say, "I've been thinking about your loss 3 months ago." And I want to share these words that were helpful for my family. This is what this Jesuit sent me, these words from Dietrich Bonhoeffer. "Nothing can fill the gap left by someone we love, and we should not attempt to find anything. We must simply endure and hold out." That might sound very harsh at first, but at the same time, it is a great comfort, because as the hole that he has left remains unfilled, so the connection with him remains. It is wrong to say God fills the gap. God doesn't fill it at all. Rather, God leaves it unfilled, and in this way helps us to maintain our true communion with our loved one, even though it is painful. Bonhoeffer wrote these words on Christmas Eve, 1943, to his closest friends, Renata and Eberhard Bethge, as he lay in prison in Tegel, later to be executed on April 9, 1945. These words of Bonhoeffer were an enormous consolation to my family. We experienced precisely in the gap of grief the way to maintain our true communion with our loved one. I have come to believe that grief reveals human vulnerability, which is, I will posit, our ability to be connected. Grief, which arises from the separation of being connected, is the exposition of our underlying vulnerability. Thus, in the Christian funeral, we do not deny the pain of death, but rather precisely touch the loss. I think this is how the disciples recognized Christ, not in spite of their grief, but through it. They dared to feel the loss of Jesus, to share the love he had for them and they for him. The grief is integral to their recognition of the resurrected Jesus. Their grief made them more aware of their own vulnerability to Jesus, to the love of God, and to the working of the Spirit. Now let me add, they grieved his death even after the resurrection appearances. Mary of Magdala grieved that she had to let go of the risen Jesus and could not hold him again. The disciples of Emmaus grieve that he disappeared after the breaking of the bread. And Peter and John assuredly looked for Jesus time and again on that beach. It was that grief that gave them the conviction to preach Christ crucified. But they, like Paul, longed for death so as to be reunited with the one they lost on earth. Peter grieved until he was crucified, and Paul too, until he was executed. Let us not think that the appearances eradicated the grief, but rather gave grief a new energy, a new reason to hope through grief. Let us turn to the scriptures to see more clearly this point. Grieving elsewhere in the scriptures. We all know the shortest verse in the scriptures is, Jesus wept. John 11:35. Note, Jesus does not begin to weep when encountered by Martha or Mary, but rather when he literally confronts the reality of Lazarus as dead. That is, when he is brought to the tomb. Grief exposed Jesus' vulnerability to Lazarus, and that is revealed to us in the very next verse, when Jesus weeps. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." Through grief, the Spirit leads us as vulnerable in the face of death through love to hope. Let's now look at the text, "Blessed are they who mourn," the second Macarism of the 8 Matthean Beatitudes. In Lucas Chan's second book, The 10 Commandments and the Beatitudes, Biblical Studies and Ethics for Real Life, Lucas was one of the first biblical ethicists. He opens up the Beatitudes by following the insight of John Climacus that the Beatitudes are a ladder of ascent. In this way, we see that we can only understand each Beatitude through understanding and appreciating the previous one. We can only ascend the ladder one step at a time. Chan notes, therefore, the overarching importance of the first Beatitude, where we start by turning our gaze on the poor in spirit, who are the most poor of the poor, economically deprived and socially alienated. Turning to the second Macarism, "Blessed are they who mourn," Chan notes that this is not a command to mourn, but rather the recognition of those who are already mourning, not for themselves, but precisely for the poor in spirit. They're the ones in the community who are weeping or mourning for the poor in spirit. By reading the Beatitudes along with the exegetical claims of biblical scholars, Chan argues that the object of mourning is not so much one's own suffering or sins, but rather the concrete human experience of poverty and suffering encountered by other community members. He adds, it is about a certain disposition that genuine disciples have with one another, such that if one suffers, the other mourns as well. Grieving for the other's loss, their alienation, suffering, or death is the beginning of the beatitudinal response to the call to genuine discipleship, that is, of responding to the poor in spirit. It is what the Spirit recognized in the upper room, and it is what precedes all else in the ladder of ascent. For the Christian, it is not the denial of suffering and death, but the encounter with loss and suffering of another. Entering into the loss, we are led by the Spirit as the disciples were led to not only recognize the risen Christ, but to unabashedly preach him. I have been writing and speaking on the topics of vulnerability and recognition for the past 5 years, and I do this because I believe that prior to acting in conscience, we need to be vulnerable, which gives us the capacity to recognize. In order to act on that recognition, we need subsequently to turn our consciences to deliberate about what we should do. What I'm proposing here is that we have to understand that vulnerability is the condition by which one has the capacity to recognize another in need. And unless we're vulnerable, we won't do the recognition. And then conscience comes into play. Conscience comes into the play when we recognize, see a situation, and now ask ourselves, what do we do? What do I do? What must I do? So that's where I'm trying to lead you. My interest these past years has been to explore what precedes conscience, and I argue that what conscience needs is a vulnerable disposition that recognizes what is needed. Now, however, here in Saskatoon, I am arguing about ways that we get a glimpse of how our vulnerability becomes alive, and I am arguing that a look at grief helps us to see how we humans are vulnerable, and that precisely by staying in touch with that vulnerability, we are led by the Spirit to encounter hope in the face of death. In another, I should mention this in light of Michael's death. When I started working on this, I ended up developing an advanced melanoma, and I was treated for it for quite a long time, a period of time. So living with that experience, I learned a lot about vulnerability. I go into it elsewhere, but I just thought I would put that into the mix here. I know that many of you here have had similar experiences of grief. I am deliberately trying to tap here into the vulnerable experience of grief because I think that the key to life is an ability to live cognitively, emotionally, and spiritually within one's own vulnerability while being in union with others in theirs. In other words, the key to life is to be vulnerable. Indeed, I do not think that Peter, the Magdalene, Mary, the mother of Jesus, Thomas, or John ever really left their grief behind. In fact, Paul himself so resonated with the death of Jesus that he therein found his freedom and the promise of life. I think for them, as for Bonhoeffer, the gap that death causes is never really closed. I think this is why Paul in Romans 8 assures us that we are led by the Spirit precisely in our sufferings. We groan, he writes, through our sufferings into becoming the children of God. And this groaning occurs through, as Paul notes, the present time. He adds, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. Whether in grief, in suffering, we experience the Spirit leading us, accompanying us, expressing for us and from us what we yearn and hope for. In the rawest moments of human vulnerability, the Spirit gives us hope by her own actions. Where we are vulnerable, the Spirit finds her home. So now something on vulnerability and recognition. Let us look at ethical connection between vulnerability and recognition, which I argue initiates the unfolding of the moral life. That's in this book of mine. I begin with grief, and then the second chapter go right to vulnerability. For the past several years, I have begun exploring the question, what gets a person to act in conscience? This is what I have begun asking, what prompts moral responsiveness? Interestingly, Thomas Aquinas also recognized that there was something that inclined conscience to act. He called it synderesis, but I'm just going to leave it there to simply say that he's looking at the same thing. Like Thomas, I want to argue that something precedes conscience, something that inclines us toward the good, toward the neighbor. In what follows, I want to first examine vulnerable dispositions and then recognize, and then I will close by returning to the Spirit, and in particular to the work of Thomas in the Spirit, prompting us in our vulnerability the needed recognition that we need to have. I began these investigations because I saw that in the Bible, for the most part, moral failure was not about getting things wrong. Rather, moral failure was prior to that. Moral failure was really the failure to bother to respond in the first place. The priest and the Levite did nothing when they passed by the man on the road in the Good Samaritan parable. They did nothing. That was the whole issue. They did nothing. It's not that they did something wrong. It's that they did nothing. The goats don't see the hungry and the naked in Matthew 25. The rich man steps over Lazarus in Luke. None of them are harming these people. Most of us tend to think of sin as something that we did. For the most part, in the scriptures, sin is something that we didn't bother to do in the first place. None of them respond. None of them do anything wrong. The problem is that they do nothing. It's not that they get wrong something in conscience. On the contrary, they haven't even started to use their consciences. Is there something then that starts the ball rolling? Is there something that precedes the act of conscience that considers, what am I to do? Is there something we are not forming that eventually gets one to act in the first place? I think the problem is that we teach people what moral action is, but we don't adequately consider whether they are vulnerably disposed to the other in the first place. In a similar way, besides being vulnerably disposed, do we know that they will actually recognize the other as well? I think there are two steps before acting in conscience: being vulnerably disposed and then actually recognizing the person in need. I think we teach people what they in conscience should do, but we rarely address the preconditions of the conscience act. Let's look at the Good Samaritan parable. I do not know if the priest and the Levite could have acted in conscience, but I do know two things. Neither were vulnerably disposed to the injured man, and neither gave him the recognition that he was injured and in need. On the other hand, the Good Samaritan's first recognition of the injured man gives evidence of his vulnerability to the wounded man. Then, after he recognized the man as being in need, he in conscience went about the details of what he needed to do. Acting in conscience, he needed to figure out how to clean the wounds, get him to a safe place, make inquiries about the appropriate place in which to leave him, negotiate and secure from the innkeeper his oversight of the injured man, dispense with his funds, redesign his return to this particular inn so as to take the man with him, etc., etc. These are all the works of his conscience. The Good Samaritan's conscience got a work out, but the work of his conscience only began when his vulnerable disposition recognized the man. The recognition led then to the conscience question, now what do I do? Like many others, when I first thought of vulnerability, I considered singularly as being wounded, as primarily a condition that raises in others alarm and concern. From the writings of Judith Butler, among others, however, I began to see vulnerability as less being wounded and more being capacious and more responsive, much more like those who emerge from the upper room, capable of preaching. When I recognized that the word vulnerable does not mean having been wounded, but rather being able to be wounded, then I began to see how it means being exposed to the other. In this sense, vulnerability is the human condition that allows me to hear, encounter, receive, or respond to the other, even to the point of being injured. Or as we saw earlier in grief, when we lose someone in death, we see the nakedness of love and the vulnerability of grief. There we see that our humanity is identified with our vulnerability. Being vulnerable should not be reduced, therefore, to being injured or precarious. Precarity being in an unstable or risky situation where the possibility or the continuation of harm occurs. Butler realizes, too, that many people think of vulnerability as primarily being in an unstable context, but she rather wants us to understand that all of us as human beings are vulnerable to one another, and precisely when one's vulnerability is at risk, we vulnerably respond to that other. So wisely, she distinguishes precarity as a moment of risk for the vulnerable human. She notes precarity exposes our sociality, the fragile and necessary dimensions of our interdependency. But our vulnerability is not reduced to precarity, a moment of instability. For this reason, I do not identify grief and illness with vulnerability, but rather they bring us into contact with the vulnerability that defines us as humans. Following Butler, I think of human vulnerability as the capacity for responsiveness. In shared grief, we mutually recognize our human vulnerability. We mutually recognize our capacities to love one another. Vulnerably, we continue to love in grief. I want us to be careful about thinking, however, that we need to suffer in order to be vulnerable. As vulnerable, we need to be responsive. We need to be like the mourners, the meek, and the merciful in the Beatitudes, those responding vulnerably to the poor in spirit as we ascend the ladder of ascent. The experience of grief shows us not in need, but as vulnerable. We would not grieve if we were not so vulnerable to one another. It's our vulnerability to one another that we are feeling, encountering in grief. Watch how vulnerability works in the Good Samaritan parable. You know, the Good Samaritan parable is really a teaser. The Good Samaritan parable begins with the question, who is my neighbor? And so Jesus then tells the story. And he's being asked, who is my neighbor? Because he said that we need to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so you're waiting for who is the neighbor. And the first thing you hear is this man on the road who's injured and wounded. So you think, that's my neighbor, right? And it makes sense because that's who you're supposed to love. But what happens at the end of the story? Who is the neighbor? The one who showed mercy. So the neighbor has flipped. It's not the man on the road. It's the one who showed mercy, the agent. How did that happen? I think the key is vulnerability. Watch how vulnerability works there in that parable. At the beginning of the parable, we think the man wounded on the road is the neighbor. Surely he's the vulnerable one. But after the priest and the Levite pass by, we see the Samaritan recognize the wounded one. We recognize in the Samaritan his vulnerability. At the end, we want to be like the vulnerable neighbor, the one who showed mercy. Like the notion of neighbor, vulnerability moves from the wounded one to the responsive one. Watch how, similarly, vulnerability works in the prodigal son parable. At the beginning, the son's own precarious vulnerability is evident. But while the beginning of that parable focuses on the younger brother's situation, the center of the parable emerges as we recognize the vulnerability of the father, who recognizes his son in the distance, embraces him, reincorporates him, and works to restore all that was unstable, threatened, and exposed and jeopardized. Like the vulnerable Good Samaritan, the vulnerable father recognizes his son as the precarious one, a humanity not recognized by those who left him to eat with the pigs. Butler recognizes how fundamentally foundational vulnerability is. She writes, ethical obligation not only depends upon our vulnerability to the claims of others, but establishes us as creatures who are fundamentally defined by that ethical relation. Vulnerability is what defines and establishes us as capable of being moral among one another. Again, emphasizing the priority of vulnerability, she contends, this ethical relation is not a virtue that I have or exercise. It is prior to any individual sense of self. So she thinks of vulnerability as prior even to the sense of self. It is not as discrete individuals that we honor this ethical relation. I am already bound to you, and this is what it means to be the self I am, that I'm first bound to you, and then I'm a self, receptive to you in ways that I cannot fully predict or control. Vulnerability essentially is what most qualifies myself as being bound to and among others. She returns to the priority of vulnerability as prior even to the moan from another in need. You know, think of this fact that you can be in a neighborhood, you get attacked, what do? You cry out for help. You don't know anybody in the neighborhood, you cry out to help. Why? Because you believe a human being will understand what a cry for help is. There's something that we're hardwired with. This is this vulnerability that causes us to recognize something in need. You call upon me, she writes, and I answer. But if I answer, it was only because I was already answerable. That is, this susceptibility and vulnerability constitutes me at the most fundamental level, and it is there, we might say, prior to any deliberate decision to answer the call. In other words, she writes, one has to already be capable of receiving the call before actually answering it. In this sense, ethical responsibility presupposes ethical responsiveness. Our vulnerability, I write, is our answerability, what allows and prompts us to recognize, to respond, to communicate, in short, to love. Theologically, Butler's natural created answerableness resonates with a variety of creation narratives that capture the vulnerability of the human. Though not from a theologian, T.H. White's wonderful The Once and Future King. Do some of you know The Once and Future King? Yes. Anybody my age or around is waving at. Anybody younger? Okay, good. All right. He provides an account of creation that captures it beautifully. On the sixth day of creation, God gathers all the embryos of each and every species of animal life. They are rolling all over the place, these embryos, all over the place, and all look like one another. But God offers each embryo on the sixth day the opportunity to ask for an addition that will distinguish their species. The giraffe embryo gets a long neck for tree food. The porcupine asks for quills for protection. And so it goes for the entire animal kingdom. The last embryo is the human, Adam, who, when asked by God what Adam wants, responds, I think you made me in the shape which I now have for reasons best known to yourselves, and that it would be rude to change. I will stay a defensive embryo my entire life. God is delighted and lets the human embryo have no particular protection, unlike the rest of creation, to be the most vulnerable of all newborns, and says, as for you, Adam, you will look like an embryo till they bury you. Behind White's imaginative portrayal of creation is his remarkable vision of the human embryo as the bearer of human vulnerability. By positing the human as willing to remain vulnerable, White is able to disclose further God's delight in that the human now is in God's image, precisely because of the decision to stay as a defenseless embryo all my life. White concludes his account with God revealing to the human, quote, Adam, eternally undeveloped, you will always remain potential in our image, able to see some of our sorrows and to feel some of our joys. We are partly sorry for you, man, but partly hopeful. Human dignity, rooted in the image of God, participates in the vulnerability of God. This insight of our vulnerability being connected to God's resonates with the great Irish theologian Enda McDonough's work, Vulnerable to the Holy, in Faith, Morality, and Art. There he begins his treatment on vulnerability with God. God reveals to us God's self as vulnerable by the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem, by his life in Nazareth, by his death in Golgotha. Thus, sounding like White, McDonough writes that to be made in God's image is to be made vulnerable, Our dignity is rooted in God's vulnerability. So let me conclude by going to recognition. While there is so much more to be said on vulnerability, I turn now to the psychoanalyst and feminist theorist Jessica Benjamin, who studied mutual recognition among infants. Mutual recognition is the central, this is what she did a whole book on, is the central experience of infants among infants. After being, you can imagine, what is it like for an infant? After being the object of attention of people much bigger than themselves, mutual recognition is where finally an infant encounters another infant that seems much like itself and yet not. They want to touch the face of the other child. They are fascinated that this child is in front of them, just like them. They mutually recognize each other. In that moment, they recognize their humanity. Benjamin writes, mutual recognition is the most vulnerable point in the process of differentiation. In mutual recognition, the subject accepts the premise that others are separate but nonetheless share like feelings and intentions. More recently, she turns again to mutual recognition and, among other matters, finds the language of vulnerability key for recuperating and restoring the experience of mutual recognition. As in shared grief, in mutual recognition, we discover human vulnerability, our connectedness and our responsiveness. If you will, why is it that we recognize the cry in the alley when somebody else is shouting whom we don't know? It's the same thing that happened in mutual recognition. Something happened where we recognized in one another something that we didn't know was there. And that's the similarity in the care that we have for one another. The mutual recognition in infancy becomes the foundation. As we mature, the experience of mutual recognition can and should happen time and again as part of our growth as moral agents. The mutual recognition in infancy becomes the foundation for subsequent expressions of due recognition, whenever we encounter humanity in its greatest precarity or neglect. From that first recognition, where we vulnerably acknowledge the other's our own humanity, we learn to develop a sense that the other in need is another human being. Of course, as we saw earlier in the biblical stories, overlooking the humanity of another is what gives us the unfortunate permission to withhold due recognition. Thus, the work of education is to help one another to be vulnerable and vigilant enough so that due recognition and appropriate response to the other is actualized as the worthy alternative to the customary but harmful stance of overlooking or neglect. The philosopher Patty McQueen explains, recognition as an insight and a practice that develops goes from being first an awakening to second making a form of identification and finally to appreciating a responsible relationship that broadens our self-understanding. McQueen's move from recognizing someone familiar to giving recognition to whom it is due is, I think, the threshold of the moral life. What we learn in infancy is literally a first lesson. In our vulnerability, we recognize that we are related one to another. Then we move from an awakening to a form of identification. Later, as children, we realize that form of identification calls us to a form of responsiveness, especially when the other is neglected, in need, or oppressed. The awakening to and the identification with another's humanity are therefore the first steps across the moral threshold. We can return then to the prodigal son parable to uncover recognition's rich relationship with both the vulnerable and the familiar. In that parable, as the vulnerable father attends to the prodigal, he remains vulnerable to his oldest son as well, who does not suffer from precarity, but from dominance and resentment. Still, we should not think that the father is surprised. I think everybody thinks that the father is surprised by his oldest son's resentment. That's kind of silly. He's lived with this resentful kid all his life. He knows that if he goes to the prodigal, he will trigger his son's resentment. But he's so interested in being vulnerable to this one that he risks what will happen to the other. He sees his youngest son in the distance, and he knows that his movement toward that son will surely trigger the oldest son's own insecurities that are covered by his dominance. Here then we recognize the Father's own vulnerability that anchors both sons. The stability in the story is the vulnerable father as the precarious son returns and the vulnerable one tries to leave. The enduringly vigilant, attentive, and responsive father is so because he is vulnerable. So when the older son refers to his brother as that son of yours, the father wants him to recognize his brother, quote, this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. But the brother needs to be vulnerable before he can recognize. Without it, due recognition just does not happen. Concluding, prompted by the Spirit. Like the Father in the prodigal son parable, the Spirit prompts us to recognize. In his new book, a relatively new book, The Holy Spirit and Moral Action in Thomas Aquinas, this is by a Jesuit named Jack Morney, who literally died yesterday at 96. And yeah, he's just a wonderful man. He notes the idea of the Holy Spirit in Aquinas prompting, and this is the verb that often appears when Thomas uses the Holy Spirit, this instinctus spiritus sancti, was a phrase often used and dear to Thomas. Prompting is not simply being led or guided. It is an internal awakening, a counsel to take heed, to act, to respond. That is, I dare to suggest, to recognize. Remembering that recognition is the first act that causes us to cross the threshold of moral responsiveness, we read that Thomas asserts that in every action of the spiritual person, it is the initiative of the Holy Spirit which is the source and the principle of the action, and that God's children are truly acted upon, though in such a way that they themselves act. Noting the principle, which Thomas regularly observes, that no habit proceeds to act spontaneously and needs to be aroused by some agent, I think we can see that the pivotal act of recognition is prompted in us by the counsel of the Spirit opening our eyes to the other. The Spirit helps us to recognize again and again. In his commentary on Romans, Thomas writes, the Holy Spirit does not just teach us what we ought to do by enlightening our mind on what we should do. The Holy Spirit also inclines our desires to act rightly. That original inclination, being prompted, is the act of recognition. We need also to recognize and remember that all basic moral recognition is mutual recognition. Our failure to recognize the homeless on the road or the alienated in the hospital is a failure to recognize the poor in spirit. A failing to recognize the poor in spirit, we fail to engage in a true mutual recognition of our own shared humanity. When we don't recognize the man on the road, we don't recognize ourselves. Whether it's the poor in spirit or the risen Lord, the act of recognition is an awareness of common humanity, often overlooked. Let me close, prompting you to consider much further the questions that I am interested in pursuing. In my recent writings, I do not see recognition as primarily a personal or private, but rather a social act. In the limits of time, I can't explore that here, but I leave in the text here what I have written elsewhere on human recognition. But here in this talk, I offered you grief in the upper room as a way of capturing a capacious vulnerability. But let me leave you with another image, another location, so as to appreciate the richness and power of recognition, the first true act of vulnerable people. The image of the protests that began in Minneapolis on May 26, 2020, the day after George Floyd, an African-American man, was killed during a police arrest. On June 6th, an estimated 500,000 people, right during COVID, joined protests in 550 places across the country. The people in the march were recognizing that Black Lives Matter, that George Floyd mattered, and horrendously that Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and others, thousands of others, who have been killed or murdered matter, though often they are overlooked. The people in those marches were people who were grieving. They were sharing their grief in the shameful public killing of Floyd, grieving the profound racist inequity that marks my country. In their grief, they revealed their vulnerability and demanded that we recognize the legitimacy of their lament and the lack of our recognition. They called and continue to call us to a new mutual recognition to see what we cannot overlook, the injustices that white supremacy has visited on my country since the first slave ships arrived in 1619. In these past 4 years, there has been much grief and much vulnerability, and it's about time then that we heed the spirit and begin the process of recognition. Indeed, if we cannot see the Spirit calling us to recognition in the marches of Minneapolis after the killing of George Floyd, that Black Lives Matter, then we are never going to understand the Spirit who led the disciples in the upper room. And that is something we should discuss the next time I come back. Thank you. Okay.
Question?
I have lots of questions. Yeah, sorry, but I'll just do one. So I want to think about your move to highlight grief as an impulse to moral action. Obviously, that's like at the very center of this. You know, and I'm decidedly not a philosopher, so if this sort of framing doesn't make sense, just let me know. But it seems to me that the theological ethics that you're proposing is sort of inherently, as you said, affective. It's relational. It's not right to say that it's an irrational ethics, but unlike deontology or consequentialism or even a lot of strands of virtue ethics, it doesn't begin with a rational impulse. It begins with this sort of radical opening of the self to another. And so I find that incredibly compelling and deeply moving. But more than that, I wonder, is grief uniquely suited to produce that vulnerability? Is grief...
No.
Okay.
No, not at all. But I do think that in the Christian tradition, we really miss so much grief that today we miss grief. I'm doing a big essay on grief for theological studies, and I'm reading all this stuff that's coming out. Our society does not want us to grieve, period. They've actually pathologized extended grief. This is an enormous problem. My chapter on grief, I've had thousands of people tell me that they feel like I'm giving them permission to grieve because our culture so is intolerant of grief. And what happens is we grieve privately, and you're not to grieve privately. You have to grieve publicly. And the Christian tradition has embraced that. The Judaic tradition, most religious tradition, the Hindu tradition, this grief is present in religious traditions. And what I'm trying to do is make space for grief. I'm trying to establish that, as a matter of fact, grief is a form of love, that it is not about denial. It's actually an assertion of the pain that is there and of entering into that. That's what's so, if you ask a priest, do they prefer to do a wedding or a funeral? They'll all say a funeral. I mean, just try asking them. We all say this to one another. Why is that? Because we're not really needed at the wedding. We are needed at the funeral. And we stand there as recognizing their grief and allowing that grief to happen. There's something that I think that priests feel, and other people, deacons and others who are in the ministry of, and we see more and more in parishes that we find this grief ministry. This is helping people to find the permission of grieving. But I do think that grief is an exceptional experience. I don't want to say it's a singular experience, but I want to say it's an exceptional experience because most people are really surprised by grief. You don't know when you're having a good day or a bad day, and you're astonished at the amount of affect you've had for the person. When you hear that someone has died a sudden death, your life is just so torn in a way that you can't understand it. We see it on a screen and we start crying for actors. We know they're actors and we're still crying. It evokes something from us. But we do not have... The first book of philosophy, a philosophical reflection on grief, was done 2 years ago by Michael Cholby. I mean, I think I'm the first Catholic ethicist who's writing on grief. None of us write on grief. And yet, it's one of the most extraordinary experiences that have to people. And what I'm trying to do with the upper room is I'm trying to locate in the upper room that something was going back. What were they like? So I've done in America a couple of articles like, what was it like when they were all, why did they go back to the upper room? They all go back to the upper room because they need to find out what happened. They weren't at the crucifixion. The 11 of them, 10 of them abandoned Christ, and then one denied him. But what happens what happens in the upper room while they're gathered there? They're there for a while. What happens when Mary, the mother of Jesus, arrives in the upper room? We know that she's in the upper room by the Pentecost. What is it like when she enters the upper room, when they're grieving to try to find out how did her son die? What is it like when the Magdalene comes there and is trying to tell them, and they're not believing her, and they weren't even at the cross in the first place? And what is it like for her? What is it like for each of them as they deal with their shame of what they've done and yet their loss that they affect? What is happening in that upper room? And each of the Gospels use weeping or mourning to go on. But I don't find even biblical scholars writing about what's going on in the upper room. And yet that is the place where the Last Supper happens. That is where Jesus makes his appearances. That's where the Spirit comes. That's where the Pentecost occurs. And that's where they go, by the way, after the ascension back there to the upper room. There's something about the upper room that we are as silent about as we are about grief. So I'm trying to raise up grief as an exceptional but not an exclusively singular moment.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I'm wondering if you could talk about the way that you formed recognition. It seems to be very demanding, that there's lots of cries in the alley everywhere. So what do you do with the overwhelming nature of the demand of recognition once you're able to receive it?
Yeah. Say that again. That last thing you
I don't
just
know if
said.
I could say it again.
No,
but
what you just, I know, it was at the end that you really made your point. That's why that I found
yeah,
compelling.
so from what I'm taking from how you were describing recognition, it's very powerful. It demands a response.
Right.
And you talked about the cry in the alley and the babies touching each other. But I'm just saying there's so many things that are like that seem to be calling us towards recognition. So what do you do with the overwhelming, paralyzing nature of all these calls towards recognition, as you were?
So, as I say, not much has been written about grief. A lot has been written about vulnerability. There are so many people writing in the vein of Butler and others, Levinas, of course, and others on this. But on recognition, Axel Honneth and others have been really writing a lot about recognition. And I think we have to realize socially that Black Lives Matter is a good way of capturing how powerful the issue of recognition is and how much it needs to be done. So the Me Too movement is another big social movement that's basically an evoking of recognition. In many cultures, we see the untouchables in India, that they insist on being recognized because they haven't been seen. There's a certain way that we've managed to actually socially blind ourselves from recognizing. And also I want to say that in the gospel, almost all the major sins, that you think of the rich man and Lazarus, Luke goes out of his way to say that he stepped over the man. The rich man steps over Lazarus and doesn't do anything. Or the goats and the sheep in Matthew 25. They can't, the goats can't understand when they didn't see. And yet, the king comes back and says, every time I was hungry, you didn't feed me, and every time I was naked. So it's not like, 10 years ago this happened. Every time. So I think that what we're at right now is a call for recognition, that there's a certain way that the human has to begin a process of teaching one another why recognition is so important. There's been, Nancy Fraser had a big discussion with Axel Honneth about this as to whether or not it's too expansive of a concept. And yet, the thing that she would still say is it's a fundamental concept. So it's trying to raise up recognition as what I would call a precondition to conscience. So I'm going back to my episode of my students walking out of the class and shrugging when they see somebody collapse in the hallway and not doing anything after coming out of an ethics class. And I'm wondering, how come they, out of all people, did not recognize? And then I'm thinking, maybe I was not addressing their vulnerability and just maybe their memory and their knowing things rather than being somebody.
Hello. I was hoping about halfway through your lecture that you would talk about privilege at some point. And I think you got there towards the end, at least implicitly, in your reference to the Black Lives Matter movement, seeing privilege may be what delineates or constrains our capacity for recognition. But back at the halfway point, there was an engagement with the idea of vulnerability that I'd like to ask you to go back to, because I'm still troubled by what might be a sense of distance between the person who is vulnerable to the call of the other and the one who is calling out. And that's another way, I think, of thinking about privilege. So is there a critical engagement between privilege and vulnerability?
Yeah, I would say that privileged people privileged people have sold their vulnerability for a new birthright. I mean, that's what we're constantly seeing. I mean, I watch it in some of my students with their privileged status that they've grown accustomed to. They've lost recognition, but not only did they lose recognition, their vulnerability has dried up. And that's why I want to go to grief, because I know that they've had experiences of grief. And I want to at least try to use that as a way of awakening them to that they are vulnerable to some. Can they be vulnerable to those that are not yet known? So I'm really interested in, but I'm not just so interested in privileged. I just think there's a lot of other, there's sanctimonious people, lots of sanctimonious people who don't recognize so many people. It's not privilege, it's just sanctimony. I could give you a list of about 20. Privilege is one, sanctimony is another one, self-righteousness is another one. That's not sanctimonious, that's a different vice. So I'm interested in lots of the vices that keep us from recognizing and vices that eclipse our ability to be vulnerable. So I'm trying to raise up both. Vulnerability is the disposition, recognition is the act. They're deeply connected to one another. Social forces can eclipse that. And so I think that privilege is one. But, you know, looking at the world today, there are lots of other forces there, not just privilege. So I didn't go into the list of vices that I could.
Thank you so much. I am just conscious that many people in the world right now are grieving the loss of Father Gustavo Gutierrez. And as I was listening to you speak and you used the phrase, the vulnerability of God, I was wondering, what would a conversation between Father Gustavo, well known as the father of liberation theology, and connected to this idea of God's preferential option for the poor, how would that conversation between his way of seeing the world and what you're presenting here today, how might that go? So I'd like to see how you might imagine that conversation.
What is his name? Navalny, the great Russian who was murdered a year ago. So he's on the cover of New Yorker. So on the plane today, I read the whole thing on Navalny. I didn't know he was a Christian. And he makes a lot of it in his memoirs, where he says, being a Christian makes all this easy. He said, I'm not worried I'm in prison and that they're going to kill me. I'm not worried about that. And I'm not worried that I should actually have second thoughts about that. That's fine, because God's in charge, and this is what God wants of me. And I was really surprised at the candor and the clarity of this man's thoughts. I think this is the same for Gustavo. I think that in order to have real vulnerability is to have real courage, to really dare to see what's there and to announce it and to act on it and to say something about it. I remember being so struck by Black Lives Matter. I was scared to death with COVID breaking out. I'm 71. The last thing I wanted to do was deal with a respiratory illness, and I kept looking at all these things, and I'm watching 500,000 people out in protest, screaming and insisting on this. I think that real vulnerability has deep passion. I think real vulnerability allows one to see what's really going on in the world, and that sight is burdensome, is really burdensome. And then, but the essay that I really liked in the New Yorker was really his own writings, where he was talking about the freedom he had. And he tells this beautiful exchange that he had with his wife one time. And he said to her, they're going to kill me. And he wanted her to be able to acknowledge that too, that he was going to die there and they were going to kill him. And she said, I know. And he says, and how are you with that? And she said, fine. And he embraced her because he was so relieved that just like him, they both saw the inevitable as something that they could tell one another is going to happen. That's recognition. And that's real vulnerability. And that's why I think what I find about grief that I really love is the honesty in grief. When you're at a funeral, there's a lot of honesty at that funeral. Human beings are very, very honest. I'm interested in honest human beings for a change. Let me conclude. Can I conclude? Does that sound? So, one more question? I just want to read to you. I forgot that I had this at the end of my text. This is what Lucas Chan So Lucas had to do a lot of work to get where he was. He was from Hong Kong, and he dies on May 15th, 2015. But 3 days before that, he finally was free for the community liturgy at Marquette University. It was the end of his first year teaching. And it's the last community liturgy that they have in the Marquette Jesuit community for that academic year. And he never could attend because he taught during the hour of but now classes are over, so they invite him to preach. And this is what he preached. In the gospel, Jesus was saying farewell to his beloved ones. Likewise, it is supposed to be a very sad moment. Yet he turned the situation into one of great hope for his disciples. For if I do not go, the advocate will not come to you. Of course, from an earthly point of view, it may be better still to have Jesus around instead of letting him go. Why are we afraid of separation? I think it is very true that when we see our beloved ones leaving us, or we leaving them, whenever I preach at a funeral mass, I always remind myself that, if without faith, death would only mean eternal separation. Yet with faith in the Lord, the deceased, the beloved one, is actually closer to us than before, as he or she is now next to the Lord, who is always around to teach, stand by, and walk with us. Thank you. Sorry.
All right, so I have the easiest and easily the most satisfying of tasks. That I'm here. Thank you, Professor Keenan, for your moving lecture, for your visit to our college, for the time and care, the careful thought and profound labor you've put into everything you shared with us tonight, Thank you for a lecture that weaves deeply felt personal experience, wide-ranging scriptural exegesis into an important academic argument about the preconditions to moral action. You've come to us at a good time, I think. For all of us as individuals, of course, it's always a good time for this kind of work. This call for a radical opening of ourselves to others is a reminder to reevaluate how we form relations, to embrace vulnerability as a means of seeing the humanity of others and thereby embracing our own. Then also, in the life of our college, we're beginning a renewal of our college plan, and your accounting of the moral life speaks to a notion of relations and community that resonates with the values we profess as an institution. So I hope we can bear it in mind as we move forward together in community to think about where we're headed over the next 5 years. But then in terms of this place, in terms of the land on which we gather, this is also a good time. The seasons are changing from autumn to winter. It might be hard to believe for someone who lives in Boston, but winter is just around the corner here on the Northern Prairies. And we've been taught, I think of the teachings of the Métis author and Elder Maria Campbell, who gave the Keenan lecture now almost 10 years ago, that winter's a time for storytelling, for gathering in community. We might also think of the Achimo storytelling events led by our colleague Deacon Harry Lafond, which put that practice into action. As we turn to winter, I can hope that the ideas, the stories you've shared will inform our gatherings, will become a part of the stories we tell together in the coming months. So thank you. Truly thank you on behalf of everyone here at STM. This is just a small token of our appreciation. Thank you very much. And one more round of applause, please, for Professor Keenan. Thank you. Thank you very much. And then very lastly, just a quick reminder, we have a reception to follow in the library upstairs so we can continue this conversation together. Thank you again. Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it. The lecture was just so moving. I should let you.
So I don't drop anything.